Hi, this is Kerry Cunningham. Welcome to another episode of the Science of B2B. On today's episode, we're going to talk about what we know about how many of the accounts that you would like to sell to are in market and why it's different from what you think. Now, many of you will have heard of or understand the 95-5 rule. And the 95-5 rule says essentially that about 5% of your audience is in market to buy in any given quarter. And in market to buy is really the phrase that we have to focus on. Now, this research, which is really great research, very important research, I think, for all of us, was developed primarily for B2C, and it was brought to B2B by the folks at LinkedIn, who worked with the original researchers. In the original research from Ehrenberg Bass, which is the organization that did the research, they provide a formula for figuring out exactly what percentage of your audience is likely to be in buying mode in any given period of time. But most folks don't use that formula, and there's a flaw in it to begin with. Now, the great thing that we have at 6 Cents is a record of who's in market. So for all of our customers, we monitor all of the prospects they're interested in, all of the accounts that they're interested in, and we're looking for buying signals, whether it's third-party intent or anonymous traffic on their website, or even the leads and the people that the sales reps are emailing back and forth with. So we gather all of that information. And then we build models using AI that tells us which of those accounts are in market and which are not in market. And we assign a percentage likelihood for that organization to become a prospect, a pipeline prospect for our customer in the next period of time. So we're actually answering the question, how many of your accounts are in market for our customers all the time, what we do. So we have a selection of, in this case, about 600 of our customers and 19 million of the accounts that we're monitoring for those customers and an understanding of whether they're in market. And from all of that, we're able to see a cross-section of accounts. If we just look in at any given point in time, how many of those accounts are actually in market and how many of them are not in market, how many of them are early in a journey, and how many of them are late in a journey. So that's what we're talking about in the research that we've done today, and we'll get into the results of that in just a moment. All right, so many of you, or if you've watched Science of B2B, you've heard these numbers or seen these numbers before. This is from research that we did at the end of last year on the buying experience. We'll be doing that study again this year, but the numbers are very consistent year over year. And here's what we find. That the average buying journey involves about 11 people. The average buying group, that group of 11 people, is looking at 4.5 vendors on average. They have nearly 1,000 interactions with vendors across their journey, and that journey takes 11.5 months. So you can think roughly a year. Now, that average kind of buying process we're talking about a $250,000 annual value for that purchase. All right, so that tells us something, and what it tells us is that buying takes a long time, and it doesn't happen very often, as we're about to find out. So remember all that I told you about what we do with our customers. We've got 600 customers that we looked at. We have a lot more than that, but we had 600 customers. They have 19 million between them accounts that they're monitoring. And our AI is continually looking at the behavior from those accounts and predicting where in a buying process they are, or if indeed they're in a buying process at all. And here's what the data say about that. That first of all, about 60% of the audience, for no matter what slice you look at, is not in market, and about 40% is. And when you break those numbers down, here's what it looks like. Now, we've organized all of the accounts into stages. Starts with target. That means our customer thinks this is a good fit account and we want to monitor them, but there's no evidence that they're in market right now, right? That doesn't mean that there's no activity, by the way. It just means that that activity does not look to the model, the predictive model, like a buying process. That means that about 40% are in market, 17% in each of the first two stages, awareness and consideration, and then just 4% down in decision phase and 2% in purchase phase, meaning right now, this quarter, they're expected to actually complete a purchase. Now, from our research, we also know that buyers don't make their decision at the end of the buying process. They make their decision about which vendor they'd like to buy from at about 70% of the way through the buying process. Now, that doesn't always end up being the one that they buy, but very often it does. At least 80% of the time, the winner, the brand that is favored here, is the one that ends up being the one that gets purchased. All right, so a couple of other things that we really want to keep in mind here. So when we think about that buying cycle, that's about 12 months long, any account that's in this stage, the target stage, is now at least 12 months from becoming revenue for you, right? So even if you're cold calling and you happen to get somebody and you have a great conversation and convince them to go out and market to buy your thing, if their buying process is 12 months long, their buying process is going to be 12 months long. Maybe it could be a little bit shorter for you because you caused this thing to happen. But all of the data would say that that really is a very rare occurrence. The vast majority of time, buyers just decide when they're going to go into market based on contracts that are expiring, based on business needs that come up that they realize that they need to address. So if they're not in market, it's going to take a while to get there. Even if they've just crossed into being in market, they're still a long way from being able to buy your solution and actually making that decision. Now, one of the really important things that we know about this stage is that at this point, when buyers go out into market, they complete most of their shortlist. So they put 4 of the 5 brands that they're going to evaluate eventually on the shortlist here. What this tells us is that you can't win a deal here. They're not going to give you the purchase order here, but you can lose a deal. If you don't get on the short list here, it's extraordinarily unlikely that you're going to get on the list at all, and very, very unlikely that you win. Buyers buy from one of the shortlisted accounts here 85% or more of the time. So now I'll build out the rest of these just to make the point that as organizations move along through their journey, the point at which you could realize revenue from them gets closer, but also the number of accounts that are available for that becomes much smaller. A couple of points I was making a moment ago. Buyers say that before they even begin their buying process, they've had personal experience with at least one of the vendors they're going to evaluate 95% of the time. That's almost everybody. And that's for every buying persona that you can think of. All of the financial ratifiers, the IT people, the purchasing people, they'll all answer this question exactly the same way. Yeah, I know the folks we're about to evaluate. And that explains why a buying group can put 4 of the 5 vendors that they'll evaluate on the short list on day 1. The other thing that's really important to understand is that buyers are in absolute and complete control over when and if they engage with you. So buyers tell us that their first interaction with sellers comes 70% of the way through a buying process. It's the most consistent finding I've ever seen really anywhere. If you ask any member of a buying group, whether they're at the top of the organization or the bottom, whether they're the business person or the IT person involved in the purchase, they're all going to say that they had their first interactions with sellers around 70% of the way through the journey. And they're going to say that they initiated that contact 81% of the time. In other words, I'm the one who decides when we have that contact, and it happens 70% of the way through the journey. If you ask them if they say that they did not initiate the contact, that the seller initiated the contact, the timing of that contact does not change. In other words, it was a moment in which they were about to reach out to you that day or the next day, perhaps, and you happen to reach out then. It doesn't change when they're going to engage with you. And I think if you think about your own experience as a buyer in B2B, you'll realize that having a BDR, SDR, a sales rep call or email you doesn't actually change your behavior. You might store that information away. If they give you something useful, that helps. If they don't, it's a little annoying, but you're going to get in touch with them when you're ready to get in touch with them. So when we look about that B2B buying journey, a couple of things we have to keep in mind. One, you never, ever want to miss an opportunity when it's crossing between out of market and in market, because the moment it crosses that line, they're putting their short lists together. Now, a lot of those accounts right now are never going to make it all the way down to the part of the buying process where they actually make a purchase, but you still cannot afford to miss that moment. You have to be there and get on the short list. That means you have to be monitoring those signals all the time. Next, when they're in these other stages, you have to be delivering value-adding content and experiences. You cannot simply be asking them for meetings. Let's say that somebody from one of those accounts came to your website very early in the buying process. They filled out a form to see some content, which is pretty rare, but they did. And then you hound them for a meeting. You're not going to get the meeting until they get 70% of the way through the journey. You're just not. It doesn't really matter what you do. But if you're delivering content, experiences, invitations, things that they will value, you increase the likelihood that you'll be on the top of the short list when they do reach out finally. If you don't, then what it's going to look like is that you're just kind of annoying. So it's really, really important that we keep all of that in mind. Now, I've coined this term the MQL industrial complex. This is the set of practices, the set of beliefs, the set of measurements that keep us continually in this world where we think our job is to create MQLs, and we think if we create an MQL and we just chased after it, we can cause buyers to engage with us. I hope what I've shown you in the data today convinces you otherwise. The fact of somebody filling out a form does not change when they're going to interact with you. It doesn't change whether they're in market or not, and it doesn't change whether you're going to end up being the brand that they want to buy from. So that's the story that we wanted to tell today about how many of your accounts really are in market, why it's so important to see those as they go into market right away and put your best foot forward, enabling those buyers. So that's it for the Science of B2B today, and I hope you'll join us next time.